Thank you all for coming. Welcome to the Hudson Institute. My name is Michael Pregent. I'm a senior fellow here. And today we have a panel on proxy warfare, basically the model that the United States is going towards now as the U.S. public gets tired of seeing American boots on the ground in these prolonged campaigns. We've seen a tendency to go towards proxy warfare, and what I've done is I've looked at the experts that cover this topic, and I believe we have them here. I know we have them here. And I'll introduce Candace Rondeaux, Professor of Practice, School of Politics and Global Studies at Arizona State University. She's a senior fellow at New America, and she's also a senior fellow at the Center on the Future War. Is that at New America as well?
The same thing.
All right, great. Then we have Dr. Abbas Kadhim. He's at the Atlantic Council. He heads up the Iraq initiative there. He's the director. And we've known each other since 2014, basically looking at the ISIS problem in Iraq. And very good to have you here. Thanks for being here. Thanks for doing this. And then, of course, we have Dr. Tony Pfaff. I met him in 2006 when he was basically in charge of the ISIC at the Pentagon, DIA's Iraq. What would we call their intelligence cell? What was the Z for? Oh, that's right.
Is for Iraq.
Is Iraq, Roger. IRIZ. So met him in 2006. Since then, he's done a lot. He was the Iraq director in the National Security Council. He's a professor at the Army War College, and now he has joined Dr. Abbas at the Atlantic Council as part of his Iraq initiative. So both Tony and Candace have written extensively about proxy warfare. And the way we're going to do this, we're just going to dive into the contemporary operational environment, and then we're going to treat this kind of like a Sunday morning program where we have a back and forth. And we also would like to welcome the members of the J7 staff that are here looking at the joint operational environment going forward to 2040. And this is going to play a major part of that as the U.S. and our adversaries go towards proxy warfare. So with that, I'm going to start with the current situation. We have a U.S. aircraft carrier group moving towards the region to deal with threats coming from a state actor using proxies to threaten U.S. allies and U.S. interest, if you believe the intelligence, of course. We're all caught up in that debate now, whether or not this is intelligence from the Iraq War that said Saddam Hussein had WMDs. Is this the same type of intelligence? And what I would say is it's very different. There were smoke and mirrors when it came to Saddam's WMD program, but here we actually have tangible things we can see on the ground. We can actually see militant forces moving around, setting up systems. We've seen attacks in Syria. We've seen it, by proxies on all sides. We've seen attacks in Iraq, proxies on all sides as well, and in Yemen. Recent reports, if you believe the intelligence, the Houthis launched UAVs to hit an east-west Saudi oil pipeline, and then also the recent attacks on 3 oil frigates in the Gulf. So this is an example of the U.S. projecting force to a region to deal with proxies, and we're looking at whether or not the U.S. has the resolve to actually target proxies and whether they legally can, based on all of the things that are in play in these countries. So I would just like to ask each panelist quickly what your take is on the current situation as this U.S. force projection moves into the region to deal with what our State Department and Department of Defense, and now the Brits are saying, is a credible intelligence threat against U.S. interests and allies in the region. And I guess I'll start with you.
Sure. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for being here.
Well, obviously, today's situation is indicative of some of the features that are new about proxy war. Obviously, in the Cold War era, 1960s to 1990s, you had a couple of very big players. Obviously, the United States and the Soviet Union at that time. Today, you've got a lot more players in the game. You have Iran, you have the United States, You also have, and I think in the case of Iran in particular, a subset of interested parties that have their own agendas, that have the ability, or at least the permissive environment in which they can interact with proxies and direct and influence proxies. So that's another sort of feature that is unique. You know, we don't know enough, I think, obviously, about the situation with the oil tankers and exactly what happened there. But what we do know, and what we can note, is that there are some key features. One, you have more weaponry available for remote targeting, not just for states, but for non-state actors like the Houthis and others. And so that also complicates the situation. And we have seen, right, that escalation is a real challenge. And I think we can anticipate that going forward. The question that the United States, I think, has yet to resolve for itself, as I think other nations as well, you know, struggle with this, is what's permissible, right, in terms of targeting non-state actors that have a sort of tenuous relationship with, in this case, Iranian authorities, right? That depends on how you categorize them. And I think, you know, what we've written about and talked about in our reporting on proxy wars is the need to kind of look at the constitutional order of a state as kind of the bright line for how you categorize proxy forces. So in the case of, you know, the popular militia forces, for instance, in Iraq, you have seen a much less tenuous legalistic relationship. They are becoming increasingly, you know, either by force of habit or in actual fact, steps taken to integrate them into the machinery of the Iraqi government. So obviously, you know, striking them has implications for the, you know, the order of the country itself. And you have to really think that through. In the case of the Houthis, it's a little bit more tenuous. In the case of other proxy actors, say in Syria, where you have Afghan and Pakistani Shia militias operating, you know, cheek by jowl with Hezbollah, again, a lot more tenuous. So the distance, you know, the legalistic distance is measured by, I think, to some degree, the relationship of these militia forces or paramilitaries to the constitutional order of the states in which the conflict is taking place. I don't think the U.S. policy apparatus is quite yet there. But I think they need to get there in order to make some distinctions so that they can control escalation risks.
Right. Abbas?
Well, thank you, and hello, everyone. I just came back from Iraq. I spent somewhere around 3 weeks in Baghdad and in Najaf and other places in the Middle Euphrates. And to be honest with you, it's shocking to see the news here or the perceptions in Washington that Iraq is kind of that unsafe place that, you know, things can just, the sky can fall at any moment, and certain groups are going to target U.S. interests. I didn't see any of that while I was in Iraq. I visited most of the green zone areas. I was also at the U.S. Embassy there in Iraq, and in fact, the meeting that I had at the U.S. Embassy was done not inside the embassy, but in the front yard, which was a really nice place, you know, there. And going also to the Middle Euphrates, I mean, people are just being happy that they finally defeated ISIS. Baghdad is looking nicer and nicer by removing these concrete barriers and T-walls and all of that, which is a great indicator. In fact, they are talking about by this week or next week, they will eliminate most of the green zones restrictions to indicate to people that they are really, you know, having enough safety. You know, you walk on or drive around Baghdad until late night and past midnight, and things are calm and nice. And Baghdad was the safest I've seen it, even safer than in December when I was last as well. But that said, I think we should always take precaution, and, you know, because we talk about the possibility of loss of lives, loss of American lives is not an easy thing for the U.S. government to, you know, take lightly. So that's completely understandable. But back to your question, Mike, I think it's when you talk about trying to target or to hit these proxies, and if you think about it in a place like Iraq, that would be really a catastrophic event if it happens preemptively. It's you go and target people who are very popular inside their geographical regions. They have just finished helping the Iraqi military and other forces defeating ISIS. And if they have not done anything to turn that threat into an action, targeting them preemptively basically will set Iraq ablaze. And the Iraqi government right now needs as much calm as it can to face the challenges of the post-conflict reconstruction. There are more than 1 million IDPs who try to return. And getting a war in Iraq that is, without any clear indication that in the retaliation of something the militias have or the other fighting groups have done, I think that would make things very hard for the Iraqi government to walk that fine line. The Iraqi government clearly understands the challenge that is coming from armed forces that are not fully under control of the state. That is well known, and they talk about it. Also, the fact that until now they have not figured out how to implement the law that Parliament passed in late 2016 that is supposed to integrate all of these forces within the Iraqi military forces under the authority of the commander-in-chief. Former Prime Minister Abadi kicked the can down the road. I think he should have implemented that law, but he didn't want a confrontation with them either when the fight was going on against ISIS or later on in the middle of an election season. The current government, of course, is still trying to consolidate its position. We know that in Baghdad now we have the closest government that we can work with. Both the Prime Minister and the President are friends of the United States and the West. Many in the cabinet members in the cabinet are very close and pretty much very well interested in having stronger relations with them. I could not say that about previous administrations in any way credible. So we have a great opportunity, and I think the last thing we need to do is to put them between the rock and the hard place, because if the US hits these groups, then definitely they have enough supporters in the parliament, and also it will generate more support than what they have already now to probably pass laws that will force Adel Abdel Mahdi to ask the US forces to leave, to probably even do other things that are clearly retaliatory. And that will make him his task to maintain that case that we need to have robust relations with the US very hard. In Yemen, we are already hitting them. I mean, I think the Saudis are doing more than the job. They are hitting them and the civilians next to them. And in Syria, we do have, again, another dynamic going on, and they are not as safe as they are in Iraq. They are in a fight, and they are getting hit by several actors on our side or against us also. It's a war of all against all in Syria. But I think Iraq is the place where the consequences can be dire if we fire the first shot.
All right, well, again, thanks for inviting me. My work on proxy wars is primarily focused on norms, the kind of norms that should govern proxy relationships. And when I engage on this, I get two kinds of reactions. One is proxy relationships are always wrong. They're inherently exploitive and best avoided. Or as long as the proxy's cause is just, there's no additional moral concerns regarding the relationship. And I'll save the details for later, but neither one of those positions are true. But what is true is there just aren't a whole lot of norms governing proxy relationships. There's some very thin international law that we can talk about later, but it's just not out there. So it gives those who want to use proxies a lot of leeway to engage in things, to engage in activities, I think, that are morally suspect. And you kind of can see this in the current dynamic. If we accept the narrative that Iran is using proxies, they're doing, They're attacking civilian infrastructure. We just evacuated the Iraqi embassy. I'm going to guess that's because there was a threat from, Iranian-sponsored militias. And so they're able to use these to hit us where they're vulnerable, but without any kind of robust normative framework, there's not a whole lot of basis that, for us to criticize the Iranians. Sure, you can criticize the direct actor, the militant group, for the specific act, but without some kind of normative accountability, it's much more difficult to hold the benefactor, in this case, morally responsible.
So I would like to ask all three of you a question based on your initial comments. And Tony, I'll just go back to you. So you talked about the benefactor relationship with the proxy in Iraq. I mean, and those ties that need to be there. Is not lethal aid and direction and the creation of an actual proxy a legal relationship between the IRGC, Quds Force, and these Iraqi militias? I mean, that are actually being created by the IRGC Quds Force in a lot of cases.
Yeah,
Does
but
that reach a legal threshold, I guess is what I'm asking you.
it depends. So there's two cases really that inform international law. One was U.S. support for the Contras in Nicaragua. The other one was the government of Yugoslavia's support for the Serbian army during the Bosnian conflict. Now, in the International Court found the United States liable for basically meddling in Nicaragua, but not liable for the actions of the Contras. And again, whatever you want to accept about what the United States actually did, what the court found was that the United States provided the Contras with instructions on doing things that were out of the bounds of international law and the law of armed conflict. However, what wasn't the case is there was no direct communication from an organ of the state to a member of that organization, so they were not found liable for the bad acts of the Contras. Despite the fact they provided, or at least the court found that they provided some kind of instructions that allowed for that kind of activity. In the case of the Yugoslavian precedent, they did find the government liable, but only because the Serbian army was indistinguishable in many ways from the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia army. They shared the same officers. The Yugoslav army provided the Serbian army with logistics support and intelligence support, so they became indistinguishable as an organ of the state. So as long as you're avoiding that direct line, there's no real law to govern your actions and your relationship. So to answer your question, simply providing advice to a proxy legally doesn't get you liability under international law. There's, I would argue, a moral liability, but that's a different question.
And it goes back to what you said, Candace, when you talk about tenuous relationships. I mean, we're already questioning intel. Did Iran direct the Houthis to do this? And we really don't know. Are the Houthis actually an IRGC Quds Force proxy? Those arguments are already taking place now in this contemporary environment where we're moving towards the Gulf based on actions that have been taken against allies. In this case, the UAE and Saudi Arabia so far. So that tenuous relationship goes back to what Tony was saying. This benefits the benefactor who's an adversary to be able to have a tenuous relationship where Americans are going to question whether or not there was direction or lethal aid or financing of something, and it actually works in an adversary's favor that doesn't care about the rule of law or doesn't care about these legal ties that need to be present that we're looking for.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think in the case of the Houthis or some of the other Afghan, Pakistani militias in Syria, for instance, or even like you use a Ukraine or some other example, the bright lines may have more to do with the enabling capacity to visit lethality on a target, right? So let's cast back to the Afghanistan example when the United States gave MANPADS, Stinger missiles to rebel forces there. That's a clear example where that kind of lethality wouldn't be available otherwise. And the United States' ability to withdraw it was clear, right? We have sort of a historical precedent where you could kind of track them, et cetera. So some of this has to do with the technologies provided and the capacity that gives a given force, I think. That certainly implicates a different set of relationships between a sponsor and a proxy. Some of this also has to do, though, with alignment of interests. Oftentimes when you talk about proxy warfare, you talk about plausible deniability. I think today what is different about proxy wars we're seeing in the Middle East is that we really have a case of implausible deniability, right? Where it's increasingly difficult to cover or hide the tracks of non-state actors for a whole range of reasons. One, because there's a lot of stuff out there. It's easy now in today's digital age to track people and goods. And so detection is a lot more robust today than it was. So that's probably less of a concern for many states, not just Iran, and it's really not regime-type dependent. But it is an important feature in terms of signaling resolve. And there, the alignment of interests between, say, Houthi rebels and the IRGC, and then cones within cones in the Iranian power structures, you may see very strong alignment, but it doesn't necessarily mean that an order has to be issued by the IRGC to strike Saudi targets. It just happens that there's an interest to be aligned on that, which means that you may get more money, more lethal toys and goods and services and support if your interests align more frequently, right, at the right time.
Right. And to your point, Dr. Abbas, are we making a mistake in Iraq by shutting down or evacuating non-essential personnel? And what message does that send to Baghdad? Basically, you're coming back with a different story than we have this vision of Asab al-Haq and Kitab Hezbollah setting up rockets outside of the green zone and aiming towards the American embassy. But the credible intel says that's exactly what was happening. So 2 questions. Are we making a mistake by overreacting? The second question is it okay to hit Kitab Hezbollah? They're designated. Harakat al-Nujaba, they're designated. AH will probably be designated based on the fact that the IRGC and its Quds Force were just recently designated as an FTO, foreign terrorist organization. So are there legitimate targets that we could hit that Iraqis wouldn't rally around the flag? And can you do that and not lose Iraq based on the reaction of the people?
It's a tricky question. Here is the deal.
Intentionally tricky.
Yes, I know. I know that you are making it the situation itself is tricky. What I've seen in Iraq, and I left Iraq on the 7th of May, so it's just a few days ago, and there wasn't that kind of atmosphere that would, not even among the U.S. people there that I met. Or the Iraqi government, and the Iraqis are very sensitive towards making sure that nothing happens to U.S. and other foreign allies and friends in Iraq, because that's their responsibility to protect them. That is not what I've seen, the atmosphere was more relaxed than we see it here from Washington, D.C. That's one. The second part that is also important is that, yes, these groups, first of all, we don't have to accuse them that they are close or they are working closely with the Iranians and with what they say they are doing it. So it's not a matter of you are accusing them, and they don't deny that. In fact, they voluntarily said they do this. So we know that. They have been always there. Why hit them now when Iraq really is in a situation that is trying to get as much calm as they can and as much stability as they can to deal with the post-conflict? Iraq right now is facing a stage that is much harder than the fight against ISIS. The fight against ISIS was easier to defeat a terrorist organization with the whole world behind your back. Now you have to deal with the reconstruction, which requires billions of dollars that Iraq doesn't have, requires, again, a lot of effort and time to clean and rehabilitate the cities so more than 1 million people can go back and live, to reconstruct society and the nation with reconciliation, with all of the post-conflict traumas that you have to deal with the aftermath of ISIS, a whole generation for a number of years that was taught by ISIS and ISIS curricula in schools, etc. All of that. Now, to go and hit these people, are they legitimate target? If you make it as a moral argument or as an ethical argument, that's a different question. But is it prudent to go and ignite a fire in Iraq at this point if the decision maker finds that there is no other choice? Then we can talk. But if it is not really an inevitable, not really absolutely important to do it, I think that is not the prudent thing to do. To the last part of your question, yes, if we hit them, we will lose Iraq.
Just to follow up to that, is the, not an evacuation, but sending non-essential personnel home, and also a lot of our NATO partners ending the train and equip program, leaving Iraq, does that translate as a loss of confidence on the GOI and the Iraqi security forces to deal with these proxies, to deal with these IRGC Quds Force militias? Because I would tell you that I don't think Americans who look at this in DOD and the intelligence community and state believe that the Iraqi security forces can handle Kataib Hezbollah, can handle AH, can handle Harakat al-Nujaba. Are we wrong? I mean, I admit I'm in that camp. I don't believe the Iraqi security forces can take on these militias. They're fine taking on ISIS, Al-Qaeda, other groups. I don't, even Saraya al-Salam, they'll take on Jaish al-Mahdi, they'll take on Sadr's proxies, but they won't take on Soleimani's. Am I wrong?
No, you are right in terms of, if you imagine a scenario where the Iraqi forces going against the groups that you just mentioned, the Iraqi forces will not be able to stand their ground. That's for sure. The question here is, that is the Washington-centric view, which is a legitimate one. But you also have to go in Baghdad and look at it from the Iraqi view. The Iraqis don't see this as a priority. Their priority is to make sure that no second ISIS will come or another acronym. And if it happens, and it could happen at any minute, just yesterday there was a group of Iraqi officers who were ambushed on the way and they were murdered.
Right.
So the ISIS is pretty much still there in the bushes. And they say, well, if something happens and we have another Mosul, these guys are going to be the ones who will stand and save Iraq again. If we hit them and we create a war between our security forces and these auxiliaries, right, what is in it for Iraq's security and safety? The government does want this problem to go away, but it is not the problem that they want to tackle tomorrow. They have like 6, 7 other problems bigger than it before they get to it. Iraqis realize that this is a problem. That's why they passed the PMU law, which is an important law. In fact, if we were to help Iraq, we should work with the Iraqis to have that law fully implemented, because once it is implemented, it will do 2 things. One of them, it will bring all of these people under the authority of the commander-in-chief, because you will have a full structure of having new commanders appointed by the commander-in-chief and approved by parliament. They will be reshuffled. There will be no this group, that group. Everybody will have their, and the current leadership will go away. And then also the second important thing is that once we implement the law, we know the good guys, the ruly ones from the unruly ones, because those who will not comply with the law, then we know these are the guys, and the Iraqi government will begin to target them. Right now, it is so blurred that you cannot tell who is good, who is bad, and the Iraqi government is not interested, again, in pursuing this because they have other priorities. But in the essential sense, yes, you are right. That is a problem, and it is a problem that the Iraqi forces are not ready to handle, nor do they want to.
But aren't we sending a message to Baghdad that if you don't handle your proxy problem, we are ready to? I mean, Tony, what do you think this message is being conveyed, or what message is being conveyed to Baghdad on this proxy issue, specifically Kataib Hezbollah, AH, Harakat al-Nujaba, Badr Corps, things like that?
Well, I guess I want a little more clarity on the exact question, because are we talking about acting unilaterally and preemptively against an Iran-backed militia before they have done anything, particularly harmful to American interests in Iraq? In terms of, physical violence.
Let's say there's a mortar or rocket strike at a U.S. installation. What would be the legal action that the U.S. could take against a designated proxy?
Well, you're always allowed to defend yourself.
Right.
But acting preemptively to defend yourself is very problematic. And if you were to do it at all, it would have to be in conjunction and cooperation with the Iraqi government. And it would have to be done in accordance with the rules associated with law enforcement, I would think. You've got a civil order. Launching a rocket attack back kind of undermines that. So if I'm under attack, I'm allowed to defend myself. However, that doesn't entail either preemption or I would say revenge strikes, right? Or a tit for, or even escalating to a tit for tat. Whatever you would do next after attack would have to be done in cooperation with the Iraqi government. And again, particularly because you're going to be talking about doing it in populated areas, I think a law enforcement sort of mode or framework for that, where you're certainly free to go after and arrest, detain militant leaders who you believe who are responsible for the attack, but I'm kind of with the boss to actually start escalating a conflict in Iraq. Would be much more problematic.
One more thing, if I may say, on this, I'm sorry, is basically we are asking Adel Abdel Mahdi to take on a major problem, and we have to remember that Adel Abdel Mahdi is really not a very strong prime minister because he doesn't have a bloc in the parliament. He came as a compromise candidate, and in fact, as we speak, there are people who are talking about making some replacement at the top positions, parliament head, and also possibly the prime minister. And if these people we are trying to target or asking the Iraqi government to target, control a large bloc in the parliament, and they do have also allies who will be more than happy to stand with them to take Adel Abdel Mahdi off. So it's really, if we push Adel Abdel Mahdi too much, we might end up causing his government to collapse. And if Adel Abdel Mahdi goes away, guess what the alternative will be? That will be an alternative we will not like.
So I wrote that down when you said they're friends. This is the friendliest government we've ever had. And I wrote down immediately, are they effective friends? And in this case, what we're basically saying is they're not effective, but if we handle the problem for them, they'll lose their positions and something worse will come in.
They are, go ahead.
I think that's the signal. There are two hidden signals, right, in this current strategy as it's unfolding. One is we don't have much confidence in the Iraqi government, but we don't much care about their sovereignty either. That's a very dangerous signal to send to a country that you're trying to ally with. You've helped them build their military, you've helped them build their police up, you've helped them rebuild their country at great cost to both American lives, Iraqi lives, and others in the region. A very, very strong and dangerous signal to be sending to an ally for sure. But it's a signal that we repeatedly keep getting from this White House, unfortunately, is that alliances are less material to what we think the immediate threat is. And that's really problematic and challenging. I think it's something that the interagency is going to have to wrestle with because it really has implications. But the second signal, right, you talked about, whether or not there was some sort of vote of confidence issue here. But it may be more that withdrawing, targets, American targets from the board is more a signal to the Iranians on the limits that the United States is willing to place on escalation. Whether or not the Iranians can actually read that, given all the noise around, the various threats, be it in Yemen or Syria or Iraq, is another story. And I would say that actually the interagency is probably having a great deal of difficulty reading those signals.
Yeah. So is this taking opportunities for Iran to get off the table, or messaging Iran that we care about U.S. casualties, therefore we're shrinking our footprint, because if you do hit us, that would be something our U.S. public wouldn't be able to put up with. That doesn't mean we go to war. That means we probably say Iraq is lost.
So I think it's even probably less a message to Iran than it is to the various constituencies within the national security infrastructure in the United States. Right? We know that there is probably, there are probably 2 or 3 different kind of polls within the interagency around what are the limits of exerting power here. There's the whole unilateral argument, which we've discussed, I think, at length. But then there's this other issue of, okay, what do we do in the aftermath of either a unilateral strike or a response that maybe isn't proportionate or maybe fuzzes the line even further in terms of a legitimate target. A lot of times, I think, in these situations, we saw this in Afghanistan, we saw this in Iraq 1 and 2, I should say Iraq 2, that there just isn't really a lot of time to develop forethought around the what if after, right? But you really have to think about that because ultimately the escalation risks are more likely to jeopardize the long-term enterprise, right? The long-term investment and engagement. We saw that in Afghanistan, we saw it in Iraq, and it really has meaningful implications for any administration. It doesn't really matter what the political campaign promises have been around withdrawing the U.S. from interventions. It really means that you may not be able to deliver. And I think now, especially after about 20 years of a very long engagement in the Middle East and Central Asia, that there must be reluctance inside the interagency on this score, and I'm certain that that dialogue is going on right now.
Right. Tony, you and I have talked about this in the past. The goals, American goals in Iraq, and I may not have all of them, but it was to ensure the oil flow is continuous, ensure the enduring defeat of ISIS, and curb Iranian influence. I'm probably leaving off a couple, but I'd like to ask both of you, as someone very close to Baghdad and somebody who's worked on the national security and in the National Security Council, what message does it send to Iraqis if you hear that's what the U.S. is focused on, keeping the oil flow and enduring defeat of ISIS and curbing Iranian influence, and not building up your tech sectors, investment, getting American universities there, trying to get Baswari's water and air conditioning and things like that. And Tony, is when we publish these national security objectives, what are we missing in that?
Well, since I wrote them for Iraq, we're missing nothing. They're perfect. We nailed it perfectly. No, I'd frame it this way. A, we want cooperation and continue to fight terrorism. We certainly want to, and I would say it's not just about the free flow of oil, because that's actually an Iraqi interest as well. But it's about, there is an economic piece to this, and it's about not just making sure the oil flows, but also market development, getting international investment into Iraq in order to give it the kind of economy that can plug into the global economy and provide the resources it needs to continue its recovery. And it's certainly an area, and the Iranian piece is a little hard sometimes to articulate because it's, we certainly we want the space to contest the malign elements of Iranian influence, recognizing that it is a neighbor. And that and it would be ridiculous to tell the Iraqi government you can't have a relationship with Iran. With that in mind, what I hope then we're sending the message, kind of echoing on what Candace said. Hey, we want to send messages that we do respect your sovereignty, but exercising that sovereignty comes with responsibilities. We're here to help you exercise those responsibilities. That over time you become more of a contributing member to the international community than a site and a source of conflict.
If I may add something here, is this, we do need to escape the stereotype of U.S.-Iraqi relations, which is about oil or about basically the military training and equipping and security cooperation and terrorism. Look, Iraq and the United States have an agreement called the Strategic Framework Agreement. And this is only one item of it, but there are many other items that are not being activated. And when I speak with our own decision makers in this town, as much as when I speak with the Iraqis, I tell them you need to look at all of the other aspects. So for Iraqis out there, because at the end of the day, the Iraqi government is elected and it's the democratizing country, and they need to have good popular opinion supporting them. You need to show them that there are other things on technology, there are other things on education. And my being in Baghdad, I met with the Minister of Higher Education and Scientific Research, and he is actually interested in doing a lot of cooperation work with our research institutions and universities. And I said, sure, and he's sending somebody, and we will try to help them out making those connections. There are many in technology and many other things that business, all of the economy, all of that, you could really diversify that relation. So Iraqis will look at it and see more benefits coming to them from this relation. And then you will just latch on those to sort of take the edge off from what we are doing, even though cooperation on military counterterrorism and oil is important. Also, recently Iraq, we are asking the Iraqis to be independent. And for example, one of the measures, we are giving them a waiver to continue to import gas and for fuel and also some electricity from Iran. We say, you want to show us that you are having or making measurable steps towards independence. The Iraqis go and sign with Siemens, and then we are unhappy because they didn't sign with GE. And so on the one hand, what they did was really keep bringing them very close to accomplishing our policy and what we are asking them to do. But they say, okay, wait a minute. So what do the Iraqis do? They will have to come and say, well, look, GE is still running a lot of our energy sector, and here we are going to sign a $53 billion with ExxonMobil, and from the other side, the oil ministry. It's just you could always work with the Iraqis on those issues, but you need to work on the substance as well as the perceptions of this relation, because we are building a relationship with Iraq on a long injurious history that goes all the way to the 1950s, and we need to really work on that very well. So, and also the Iraqis need to take those steps. The United States is not going to knock at their doors and say, how are we going to help you with technology, education, etc. So when I speak with the Iraqis, I say, look, you really need to go and tell the Americans what you want and carry that agreement with you. One last thing is on the personnel that we just pulled. The Iraqis were mad when I was there that we are not opening the consulate in Basra or reopening it because we closed it, even though it wasn't targeted. It was a mistake. But now what did we do? We doubled down on that and we pulled our own personnel from Baghdad. You could make an argument, but Erbil, for God's sake, who's going to go to the consulate in Erbil and hit it there? But anyway, these are calculations that we have to really look at our costs and benefits and also how it plays in Baghdad.
That's interesting, as you say, how we need to address these issues, and it's decision makers in the United States that will need to make these decisions, yet they change out every 2 years, right?
Absolutely.
And that's something that we were talking about earlier. Decision makers change out, but our adversaries stay the same.
Sure.
And they marry their proxies, so the proxies stay the same. So everything the U.S. is doing is temporary. So what you just said we need to do will have to be reintroduced to new Americans 2 years from now, because we don't have continuity on this side. And that leads me to this next question to all of you. Who has a better benefactor proxy relationship, our adversaries or the United States? I guess I already know the answer to that. But if you could take my unsophisticated question and make it more sophisticated in your answers. I'm concerned that our adversaries are better at this than we are. There is a thinking that our adversaries aren't going to fight battles the way we want them to in the future. They're not going to wear uniforms. They're not going to be in an open battle space where we can use our technology to defeat them on the battlefield. They know that we are constrained by media, constrained by a short decision cycle, constrained by criticism, our laws, legalities, and they are not. So they're actually moving towards this proxy, using proxies with firepower. How does that disadvantage us? How does it hurt our benefactor proxy relationship? And just compare and contrast that, if you can, with our adversaries' use of proxies and ours, and how would how this will look going forward, I guess.
So there are other advantages, right, that we don't really talk about. In the Iranian case, there's more than just and even the Russian case, or, let's say China, with the little blue men, there's an assumption that autocratic states, have less constraints. They can act more forcefully by, making sure that their proxies have a very long tether. They have a lot of room to maneuver. There's nothing to constrain them. That's not quite true. I think certainly in the case of Iran.
Syria, would Syria be an example of
Syria's
unconstrained violence?
Well, I think it's a situation in which you can mobilize forces relatively easily if you've got an ideological and rhetorical alignment, and if you have an understanding of historical grievances in a given geographic area for minority populations. I would venture to say, if you were to flip the script and something happened here in the United States, there's a lot of proxies, right? You could activate very quickly, right? And I think we often don't think about the problem in the same way, but there's plenty of evidence, right, that Shia minorities in these kind of borderlands, that because of the colonial sort of collapse, left a lot of ambiguity around social structures and political power, particularly in eastern Iran, right, and also obviously in Syria. What Iran has as an advantage is the ability to mobilize those forces and get those forces aligned on interests because they share those interests. There's more alignment there than you would see in the United States with our so-called proxies, our partners, simply by dint of the fact that they're in the same geographical area. They have a shared history. And I think we often miss that piece. There's the constraints, but there's also the lack of sort of connectivity politically with a lot of the actors that we are working with in the Middle East right now.
Well, and in different countries, we have different situations. In Yemen, there isn't much of a proxy that you can really put your weight behind. I mean, the fighters, if not al-Houthi, then their adversaries are either al-Qaeda or some tribes that are working with the Emiratis and the Saudis. And we allowed ourselves to lead from behind on that one because we allowed the Saudis to lead. And the United States normally in major conflicts are best when they lead coalitions. We are not good when we let someone else lead and do whatever they want. So what did we do? The coalition we are supporting basically have been accused time and again by the UN and others by possibly committing war crimes. And we are just sitting there getting the bad name from what the Saudis are doing. The Saudis started a war. They don't know how to end it, nor can they win it. And that is a problem. So Yemen is a very bad situation. In Iraq, we don't have proxies, let's face it. And the Iranians are getting advantage because they do have proxies and we don't. Our proxy is basically not really a proxy. It is the guys we support are the Iraqi government and the Iraqi military, and that's not a proxy by definition. And the Iranians do care about Iraq more than we do. We can afford losing Iraq. The Iranians cannot. 1,400 kilometers of border, thousands of years of history, $12 billion of trade exchange going towards 20 billion, all of the other, the religious affinities, social, everything that you can imagine between Iraq and Iran, that entanglement, it cannot. While we don't really have as much stake nor as much attitude to beat the Iranians in Iraq. In Syria is like old Lebanon and during the civil war time. It's really unclear. We are not the only players or not the only major players. The Russians are there and we have to also play with them according to a certain set of rules, closest you can get to the Cold War rules. There are other groups that we cannot even tolerate, terrorists and others. Assad himself, who is there and is not there, and we cannot have even an international consensus on his situation. Syria is a chaotic situation where our proxy use is less effective than others, in addition to what you just well articulated. There's so many constraints that we put on ourselves as a good actor in the world or trying to be, that others don't have to adhere to.
Right. Well, I think one thing interesting before I get to Tony is we actually had a proxy relationship in the ISIS campaign with not only the Hashd al-Shabi, but also with the Peshmerga. And I think if we talked about our proxy relationships now, This is for you too, Dr. Abbas.
I don't think the Peshmerga would like to be called a proxies because
No,
they see themselves
they were.
as-
I use proxy in a term,
I
an
see.
ally,
Yeah.
an ally on the ground. With the SDF is a proxy force, as an ally, a temporary ally, and these allies shouldn't be temporary. At least they never thought they were, and it goes to Tony's writings about the benefactor-proxy relationship when the proxy is used for tactical gain, yet has a divergent strategic goal. And in the case of the U.S. benefactor-proxy relationship, we've abandoned our proxies in a way. There's distrust in Kurdistan. There's distrust with the SDF. There's distrust from the Hashid al-Shabi against Americans when the Hashid al-Shabi, like you said, can claim credit for Tikrit, can claim credit for Hawija, maybe not Ramadi, maybe not Fallujah, and maybe not Mosul, but Sinjar, places like that, right? And the U.S. proxy relationship in this case is very negative, is strained to the point where there's distrust, and it's harder to do things. And our adversaries are a little bit better at it than we are. But to your point about Saudi Arabia and Yemen, I think the Saudis are trying to fight a U.S.-style campaign without a ground force in Yemen, without a military victory yet in Yemen. You can't do stability ops at the same time you're doing an air campaign against individuals mixed into a civilian populace. And the argument of, well, look at Syria, look how many people were killed there. There's not a benchmark that you can get away with. You can't kill 500,000 and say, as long as you're under Assad, you're okay. That's one of the issues. But they can also point to the U.S. ISIS campaign in Iraq and instances where the U.S., whether you killed some civilians in Mosul by dropping a 500-pound bomb in an ISIS position, or you attack the hospital in Mazar-Sharif in Afghanistan. Our adversaries can take out 20 hospitals in Syria. The Wagner Group can be decimated by U.S. air and lose 250 men and Putin not care. So there's these different relationships. Maybe that's more of a statement than a question, but if you care to comment on that, Tony, or anyone.
Well, I was focused on your, I don't know that I have a direct response to that. Going back to your original question, kind of depends on what you mean by better. Now, in terms of, and if you're talking in terms of, practicality and effectiveness, I think it's important to remember that the use of proxies hasn't been a dominant element, hasn't been, a dominant element of our strategy for a long time. It's not that we don't use them, but, our dominant strategy has been about forward-basing and doing the heavy lifting ourselves on behalf of partners.
But is it the way forward?
Well, that's why this is becoming a question. That's, I think, why Candace did her great study. That's how I got involved in looking at these questions. I was asked to take a look at, what a normative framework would look like, and for a lot of reasons, to include a diversifying world order, as well as predictions about resource constraints. The use of proxies are going to be probably more prevalent. Now, that's where it goes into the definitional question. Proxy does kind of have a pejorative sense to it. But I think in these kind of discussions, I would remove that pejorative sense and just, and for me, the salient aspect of a proxy relationship is simply surrogacy. That, one actor is doing something, the other actor either can't or won't. On that actor's behalf. So with that in mind, the next way you could ask, in terms of who has the better relationships, then is the normative piece. And that's where questions about alignment, it's not just about alignment of interest, it's also about divergent of interest, because you have to calculate both in order to understand, in order to determine the strength of the relationship, because that ties into your other problem, or your other concern, which is when you don't have perfect alignment or you have a lot of divergence, that's when you set conditions for abandonment. And I think that's one thing that has to be worked out in terms of the norms, is that there is a commitment, and there needs to be, at least a mutual understanding of what that, what the limits of those commitments are.
My two-finger?
Yeah, of course.
One, I want to come back to your comment on Wagner, but I think that's right, that the alignment and divergence is really key. Where the United States may fall down is also on an assessment of an adversary's divergences. We pay no attention to that whatsoever. We assume that, the Houthis are lockstep, or the, PMUs that are aligned with Iran are lockstep. But we don't spend a lot of time thinking about where those divergences are, how they can be exploited. And that is the difference between the United States and Russia, I would say, where I think that there's a keen understanding of alignment and divergence. But on the Wagner piece, I think Putin did care in that instance. I think there's plenty of evidence. One, the disinformation campaign, we're not here, they're not there, ich tam net. The kind of shifting on the numbers, first it's 5 that they claim, then it's 19 ultimately. I mean, there's lots of signs that Putin cared.
Cared about the blow to the image, the brand, or the loss of life?
The puncturing of the deception, right? Because there's this idea that, Wagner is there, that Wagner is Wagner. I'm not going to get into that now, but Wagner is not Wagner. There's a cogent, coherent command structure. It belongs to state-run enterprises that are militarized, essentially. That's number one. So the deception is, that is not the case, right? That, in fact, these are just sort of these spooky actors that are running around, doing things apropos of nothing. But in fact, Russian state interests there are about the energy infrastructure. And we miss those signals because we spend too much time thinking that Putin doesn't care. That's not the right assessment. This is our number one challenge, is understanding where interests diverge amongst our adversaries and their proxies.
What's interesting is you mentioned Lebanese Hezbollah as having a tenuous relationship now at this point. We've actually seen Lebanese Hezbollah deny that they were responsible for rocket attacks and actually tell us who actually did it, and it just happened to be IRGC Quds Force proxies in Syria. So those things are interesting. Where our proxies, the strategic divergence with our proxies is they want something for what they did for us. There's a hey, we helped you do this, so you should support this. We've seen that with the KDP. We've seen that with the YPG. We've seen that with others. And I think Baghdad is now in that situation where the proxies are saying, we did this, now we want something. And that's the dilemma. We said no to ours, and I think Baghdad is saying, okay.
Well, we need to draw a line between proxies and mercenaries. These are not people we are paying or supporting to go and fight our war, and they have nothing in it. Proxies are people with local causes. They are primarily fighting for those causes, and then there is a byproduct of what they are doing in it for their supporters or sponsors, patrons, you name it. That's the U.S.
For the sake of the panel, though, the YPG, the SDF in this case, we're going to call them a proxy. The Hashd al-Shaabi, we're going to call them a proxy. The different groups inside, we're going to call them proxies as well.
That's fair enough. If we think about all of these groups that get support from a foreign patron, be it the United States, be it Russia, be it Turkey, be it Iran, or you name it, Saudi Arabia, they have, essentially they are formed and they are fighting for a local cause that they are caring about that much. And then there is a margin of it for the sponsor. If you exceed that margin, then you will have to bargain hard to justify that excess that you want them to give you. And that is where I think the problem. First of all, most of these proxies have brains of their own. If you look at those fighting groups in Iraq, I always categorize them under two categories. Groups that are Iraqi, they are fighting, and they are primarily doing something that is, they see it as for Iraq, and then they see the help they get from outside as a necessity to continue the fight. And there are others who are really doing it for Iran, and they tell you that. They are not doing it for Iraq. For them is a secondary thing. It's just the theater they are operating on. And that is completely, you have to treat them differently, and you have also to analyze them and understand them differently. Same thing with those that we are working with. As much as you can give them that they will claim as a local cause, then you can have them effective on your behalf. But the moment your margin exceeds what they are willing to give you, then you will have a problem. You will see them either committing or acting against your will. They are trying to maybe even find alternative sponsors to continue their fight. They will develop an interest and a mind of their own, and it's very hard to maintain them under your own alliance if they see that you are exploiting them, not helping them to further the cause for which they are fighting. And the balance here and the equation is a very delicate equation that you have to handle it in the right way, because otherwise you risk losing them and losing all of the investment you made into them, or worse, turning them against you. And some of them, in fact, they will turn against you one way or another. I mean, the Taliban in Afghanistan is a great case, where they see you as their last enemy, so they are willing to take your help, and then when time comes, they will turn against you. But even those that don't have that in the embedded or inherently in their genes, you could run the risk of losing them or having them turn against you if you really heavy-handedly make too much demand on them and give them coercive incentives.
We're actually seeing our proxies preemptively hedge their bets, especially in Syria, where you have elements that are willing to lose gains against ISIS in order to better their strategic goals down the road by working with the Assad regime, or working with Turkey, or working with Russia, because of this U.S. abandonment, this temporary alliances for temporary successes, and a permanent cycle of violence. The continued reintroduction of U.S. troops to a region that keeps incubating existential threats. I'm going to open it up to questions soon, but is there anything that you would stress to this administration now? I mean, literally, we're moving a military capability to the region to deal with proxies from a state sponsor. Put that in quotes. What would you tell an administration official in charge of this? What would you say?
Two things. There's two ways to deal with the escalation challenge. One is to face the reality that any unilateral strike will result in, I think, some of the things that are being talked about here, which is potential collapse of the Iraqi government. I mean, it has implications that can go on for years, if not generations. So, that's the first thing that really has to be considered here, is just those implications. Take the time to really map them out and ask yourselves, right, whether or not you really have the mandate here in the United States to take on that generational challenge. Because if you don't think you have it, then don't do it. Right. That's number one. Number two, if you want to deal with the escalation challenge, you're going to have to understand, as I said before, the divergent interests of all the players on the playing board, basically. And there, I don't see any evidence that work has been done yet. And there's plenty out there. It's oftentimes in the simple things, which is what kind of technologies are actually available, okay? If in fact the Houthis are using, armed drones, what kind of armed drones? How did they get that capability? What does that mean about the supply chains? What does it mean about the brokers in between? Is it more effective to cut off those chains than to go to war full scale in Iran right now? And are you prepared, right, for what it means if there's collapse? Because again, if Iraq collapses, Iran will not be very far behind in this instance. We've had enough erosion of stability in the region now that we've got to assume that escalation is not just going to be sort of a simple tit-for-tat situation. It's a rapid cascade to full-on regional war.
So the message we're actually trying to send is, one, to Iran by threatening to hit a proxy. So in the case of Iraq, talking about the collapse of Iraq if we do something, or at least the tilt away from the United States towards Iran if we do something, wouldn't the argument actually be to hit, let's say, an Iranian gunboat in the Straits of Hormuz, the designated IRGC Quds Force Navy in the Straits of Hormuz? Maybe we don't look at hitting the proxy, we look at hitting the benefactor. And it doesn't have to be kinetic. It's like what you're talking about, breaking that chain of support, or doing something like that. I mean, is that even feasible?
Well, again, that would put the question out of the scope of the topic because and then you are going to the direct war between the two adversaries, the United States and Iran. And the question is what Candace just mentioned, is that if you are doing it and you are hitting Iran directly, the question is, are you prepared to the worst case scenario that could happen if the Iranians decide to retaliate and then you end up having to really involve yourself in the doctrine of sinking costs. The more they hit you back, or maybe they would hit, targets of allies in Saudi Arabia or other things, the Fifth Fleet that is in their laps. There are so many other things, and then the question: are we ready to invade Iran, for example, and are we ready to go to a full-scale war? Also, what about those allies of us like Kuwait, who are sitting there in a corner where all of their oil goes and their revenues go through Hormuz, and they could be also lost in the crossfire. Iraq itself is a country that probably will be sucked into it. These are, it's hitting one little thing in the boat or whatever in the Strait of Hormuz. Why it might be seen as an isolated calculation to be an easy to make, but the question is what consequences are and how far you are willing to go with the consequences. Again, with the caveat that this is out of the scope of dealing with proxies or using proxies. And in a sense of, it will also take us back to, your original question about effective and non-effective allies in Iraq. If any escalation end up causing the government of Adel Abdel Mahdi, his government to collapse, then, yes, it might be right that they are not an effective ally, but I would take an ineffective ally over an effective adversary that will follow him. Because the last time we had an effective adversary, we were asked to leave and we had to leave Iraq. Right. So Adel Abdel Mahdi right now, I have it on good sources that he would never sign that memorandum or to say, U.S. has to leave no matter what the pressure is, unless we really push it to a point where he has to or his government collapses. So there are so many really ways, but if I were to really advise our own people, in addition to what Candace just mentioned, is to work in a place like Iraq through the Iraqi government, strengthen the Iraqi government, fortify its sovereignty, then you don't have to worry about the encroachments of Iran, because Iran's encroachments are because of the weakness at the central government in Baghdad, and there is a lot to do with that. But also in other countries like Yemen and Syria, we should depart from the essential questions. Is there any national interest of the United States that is threatened, or are we doing some of these conflicts as a gratitude, or as a gratuitous favor for our allies? The way I see it, a lot of what we are doing in places like Yemen, Syria, others are just for our allies. And the question at the end of the day, is it worth it that we are involving ourselves directly or by proxy is just to please the Saudis or the Israelis or anyone else?
Being an ally of the United States should also mean something.
It does, but
doing favors for an ally is actually, that's why you're allies to begin with, is to do things. But I'm not talking about
cost benefit.
The Saudi relationship. How can the U.S. help our ally Iraq with its Iran problem? Specifically Kitab Hezbollah, specifically Harakat Najaba. How can we help with that? You said it's a long-term thing. Is that really the answer? It's over the long term we help? We can't do anything short-term?
I think when the Iraqi government is strong enough, when their security forces, official security forces are strong enough, they will not need to have those groups. The Iraqi government is acting right now in a Machiavellian way. They do not want to start a fight with these groups because they need them at the end of the day. Also, they are not able to defeat them heads-on. But if you have a strong Iraqi government, there will be no need for these guys. Also, these guys receive a lot of backing from the people and also from the Najaf Marja'iyya and others. And the only reason...
I'm talking about the Hashd al-Shabi. I'm talking about...
Even right now, because, again, once you strengthen the Iraqi government and they are standing on their feet with credible military force, then the next step will be logically to apply that law. Once you apply the 2016 law, then it will immediately sort out everything and it will leave these few unruly actors on the side. and then you will have enough sources of authority that will delegitimate them if they go against the government. Right now, everybody is hashed, including Kataib Hezbollah, including in Iraq, there isn't a line drawn between all of these because the law has not been implemented. And that is what we don't see from here in Iraq. And I think working with the Iraqi government on that step by step will get us there if we just continue to make demands that the Iraqi government puts the cart before the horse. We are not going to get there, and they will not get there.
Right. So, Tony, why is southern Syria different? Why is it that the U.S. and Israel can hit IRGC proxies in southern Syria, hit Harakat Nujaba, Kitab Hezbollah, and Abu Kamal and places in Al-Tanaf, and there not be these consequences of Iranian retaliation against U.S. forces in Iraq, or Hamas or Lebanese Hezbollah launching rockets at Israel? Why is southern Syria different? Why is that?
Not an expert on southern Syria.
Right.
But you know.
Why are we able to do things
so
there?
If somebody wants to call me out on the facts, that's fine. But you know, from what typically when the Israelis do strike, it's an immediate response to a strike on them, or there is some sort of intelligence that suggests that a strike is imminent. And so there's a difference between prevention and preemption. And preemption, when a strike is imminent and grave, you're permitted to, if somebody's fist is cocked,
Right.
headed your way, you're permitted to block that fist. But you're not permitted to go, knowing that somebody doesn't like you, go beat them up because you think they might beat you up later on. There has to be some kind of, violation or crime committed before any kind of, a response would be warranted. So to the extent that happens, I would say, that's sort of within what norms we have. You're allowed to defend yourself. Also, now there's also probably some practical and pragmatic considerations. I mean, since this is really an indirect strike back at the Iranians, and they're already probably in a state of animosity, there's not a whole lot more for them to do. But you were making but I want to just echo what Candace was saying. In all of these things, and maybe this is the other element to it, escalation is, as I've written, is one of the great moral hazards associated with proxy warfare. So to the extent you have a way of doing it that doesn't escalate, that may be the other dynamic that's going on here. Is it just doesn't seem to escalate, and there might be another tit for tat, but those conflicts don't expand. I'd be concerned about that, though, in the original question about what we're going to do, and I think you have to really pay attention to the chances for escalation, then ask what are your interests. Now, sure, you want to impose costs, but again, this is where the norms can help you. Because like you said, and you made a good point, it doesn't have to be kinetic. Well, what's not kinetic? Well, it's political. If you have generally accepted international norms about these things, then you can move to isolate those actors who are engaged in that. Now, I know in this case, we're a long way from establishing that. Moreover, Iran is also pretty well isolated. So, however, then again, you have to ask, what are our real interests here? And in that case, also, what are alternatives? You say we don't abandon our allies, but not abandoning our allies doesn't entail necessarily attacking directly their adversary. So, look at the Saudi, an attack on a Saudi tanker is not an attack on all Americans. So, also, what are obligations here? What can you do? Well, maybe we help them better defend. Maybe we throw some resources that way. If you can't impose a high enough cost, you can reduce the cost to you.
And sometimes you just have to take the blow because there's nothing else to shoot back at.
Well, it wouldn't make sense. It doesn't make sense to go, get back at the bad guys, so to speak, in a way that costs you more than it's worth. And particularly if it costs others more than it's worth. Self-defeating activity is never really rational.
So I'm going to open it up to questions now. Yes, sir. I'd ask that you identify yourself, ask a question more than if you make a statement, make it short and then ask a question, but if you can stick to questions, that'd be great.
Hi, Carl Golovin, a retired special agent, U.S. Customs, 9/11 responder, domain reference, and idealiveson.net. Dr. Pfaff, my question is really directed to you. You mentioned the hazards of preemptively attacking as not being politically correct, so that history is filled with examples of false flag terrorism being contrived to justify then going to war. I'd ask your perspective on the writings of a predecessor of yours at the Army War College, Dr. Alan Sobrowski, who has written and spoken both about the attack on the Liberty in 1967 as a false flag event in which the U.S. cooperated, intending to blame it on Egypt and enter the Six-Day War and expand it. Also 9/11 as truly having been a false flag event. And my question ultimately is, hasn't the U.S. for a long time, as demonstrated by political control, really simply been the proxy of Zionism and of Israel? And the imminent threat of war with Iran is to pave the way for a greater Israel.
I can answer that. No.
All right.
Yeah, no, I'd reject that viewpoint. I think we are certainly pursuing our interests, and we may be doing. We could perhaps be more consistent about it, but I think in all these cases we're pursuing what we think our interests are.
Yes. And then Omar, go to you.
I'm Namo Abdullah, journalist with Rondeaux Media Network from Iraqi Kurdistan. I have two questions. The first one, today President Trump is meeting the Swiss president to talk about the possibility of opening diplomatic channels with Iran. A lot of experts say the chances are very slim. So the question is, can the situation between Iran and the United States go on indefinitely the way it is? What is going to happen if the diplomacy is not possible? The second question for Dr. Kadhim, you don't seem to believe that the threat to Americans in Iraq is that high. So if that is the case, can we assume that the United States is evacuating its diplomatic facilities in preparation for some kind of major attack that the United States might have in mind against Iran? Thanks.
All right, so Iran de-escalation, anybody want to tackle that one? I'm happy to.
I'd like to jump in. I mean, look, this may be an instance in which the intelligence that's being read isn't just a bunch of, little tiny ships, loaded with missiles. It may be an instance in which the intelligence being read is Iran is feeling weak right now. It is unable to get goods and services because the embargo is having an immediate and unexpectedly much sharper effect. I think for some in the administration, that is an opportunity, right? To finally do what has long been talked about in this country for the better part of now 40 plus years, is to knock over the regime. But we still, in the United States, we still don't know which regime we're knocking over. We still don't understand what that implies, ultimately. So it's a good sign that there's a willingness to have a conversation and to have the Swiss intervene and to have an interlocutor in that regard. It is not a good sign that, unfortunately, the leaks that are coming out of various elements in the interagency, whether it's the IC or not, we don't know. But it's unfortunate that the picture being painted here is that the intelligence is singular. It clearly is not, and it could never be, right? And so, unfortunately, what we're seeing is an argument that's taking place about strategy in a vacuum, right? And there's a real risk that that continues going forward. And I think that's largely just because of some of the personalities that we have in place at this moment.
The intelligence report is IRGC Quds Force Iraqi militias have a rocket capability and are threatening to target U.S. installations.
That is a intelligence report.
It is, but if I saw that and it's credible, and I saw imagery of it, and I saw this militia flag, I would look at it as credible. It is a report, but it is a credible report, regardless of who's reading it, whether I have a mustache or I don't have a mustache. That would be a credible intelligence report.
Sure, absolutely. So it's not the question, we're not talking about the credibility.
Right.
What we're talking about is the context.
Right.
What are the other credible reports out there that are motivating the different strategic discussions that are going on, and what are the implications? Because if there's another way other than striking directly at a proxy that doesn't result in kind of an opacity around American intent, as well as responses from allies in the region, then that's definitely a route that we should be choosing. And so I'm just offering that I think there's probably a few credible reports about the current state of affairs, right?
Right. And Dr. Kadhim?
Yeah, I'm not in a position to tell the U.S. whether or not to pull their unessential or any number of diplomats. That's up to the people. I don't see the intelligence they see, but what I see on the ground is that it is nowhere near other times when Baghdad was really in deep chaos, and we did not pull our diplomats out. We never done it before.
We had 160,000 troops on the ground also.
No, I'm talking about even after. In 2014, ISIS was at the gates of Baghdad. They were in Abu Ghraib, and we did not do any of that. We did also when the certain groups that are part of certain militias sacked the Green Zone and went and sacked the Council of Ministers building and the Parliament building, and we still operated in that sense. So that kind of pull, if they are thinking about it, that this is something that they need to do because there is a possibility of conflict with Iran, that's a prudent thing, because then you are expecting that a retaliation will take place. But I didn't see, nor did I sense from the government officials that I was meeting and talking to, that there is an alarm that these groups are going to basically fire the first shot or just go and sack the U.S. embassy, for example, or the consulate in Erbil, which is, again, impossible, but even the embassy, because if there is anything that is considered a threat today, it is no different than what it was 2 months ago or 3 months ago or 4 months ago. These groups were always there, and in fact, they were more aggressive months ago than they are today. So this is my point.
But Iraqis, though, right?
Sorry?
Aggressive against Iraqis, not necessarily Americans.
No, they even, there was a couple of incidents where we had some shells lobbed at our own interests, but that is that. So again, I mean, it's a decision ultimately to the U.S. decision maker, because I respect what they are doing, because we've seen cases where somebody didn't take a decision, and we had Libya, and we had other cases. That I wholeheartedly understand, but I don't, again, I don't see this episode is consistent with what we have done in Iraq, at least even since 2011, when we exited the country militarily. Thank you.
Tony, do you want to say something?
Yeah, I mean, so I was a defense attaché in Baghdad for a year, and we went through this, more than once. When we were considering striking Syria, we got I imagine the same thing that the current embassy has, an increased set of reports saying, Iran-backed proxies or militias are positioning themselves to strike the embassy. In fact, we did have a couple of rockets head our way. They missed by, it could have just been some, kids. I mean, it was just really poorly.
We still close
there was
the
no
doors for the consulate.
no sophistication you would associate with an IRGC operation involved. So we went to that. We had an evacuation. I don't think it was as big as the current one, but we moved people out. So it kind of goes back to the problem is that if you're talking about, again, even if you know where they're at, preemptively striking them, you're going to bear a really high cost for that. We've already kind of articulated what that is. You're going to alienate the Iraqi government. You're going to give the Iranians a chance to portray that as you as the aggressor who don't care about Iraqis, and they're going to use that for a lot. And while you might prevent what is a moderately effective or ineffective mortar attack or a rocket attack, you're going to bear a huge cost for that. What do you do in those kinds of situations? Well, you look for ways to impose costs when you can. I would increase pressure on the Iraqis to engage in law enforcement activities, to get these, to disrupt, if nothing else, just disrupt what these guys are doing, because the Iraqi security forces probably can do that with enough pressure and incentive. And then the other one is to reduce costs where you can. You can hit a building, and we do that by, our buildings are fairly well fortified. You take reasonable measures to protect yourself, and you do get maybe we already disagree, you do get the non-essential folks out there while this period of heightened tension. Ultimately, but the other thing you don't do is you don't let it hold your own policy hostage. If you need to do something somewhere else, you just understand the risk you're taking and take measures to reduce the costs associated with that risk. But you don't want to give them that advantage either.
Right. Omar.
Thank you, Mike. Great discussion. Question primarily for Dr. Abbas, but also open to the panel at large. You raised a great point about the ISF, the Iraq Security Forces, needing to expand their capability to be able to stand up and take on the militias in the future, especially the ones that challenge the law and state authority. But the fact that we're discussing this issue means that the militia is also aware of that, and they are going to embark on a campaign to expand their power as well, to make sure that they don't lose parity or they don't lose this struggle for a balance of power. So the question is, what can the Iraqi government and the US do to prevent this, prevent the militias from growing their force to match the capabilities of the ISF? And this brings us also, I think, to another aspect of it is military force aside, or military capability aside, what are the political conditions that are needed for the Iraqi government to take action? And it's hard to imagine the prime minister right now, given his political considerations and the lack of a political parliamentary bloc of his own, to take on his allies in the Council of Representatives. So is this something that will have to be put in the icebox, so to speak, for the duration of the current parliamentary bloc term, or is there any kind of change in political dynamics that we could see that could create the environment that is suitable for action? Thank you.
Thank you, Omar. Good questions. In brief, I could tell you first, I think any call for dismantling these groups immediately is as bad as it is when we dismantled the Iraqi military in 2003. And if there was any lesson to be taken from that, is we should not do this. With the difference that the previous forces were the henchmen and the tools of Saddam Hussein's tyranny, so there was even a moral argument for that. I think it's very hard to make a case to the Iraqis that we should give these guys the same treatment right after they helped defeat ISIS. On the prudence side of it is that you are talking about a group that are probably among the best trained, most experienced in the world nowadays, having had this brutal fight against one of the worst terrorist groups. You talk about people, among them there are people who could make an IED out of what's in the room, and just these water and whatever pencils, and you don't want really to turn them out and tell them, that's it, not even with a thanks, and send them to an economy that doesn't have jobs for them, doesn't have any safety net for them. In other words, make them disgruntled. And that is not prudent. I think Iraq can afford freezing them, as to use your word, and for a while until you get to the position where you could do that. And as far as the dismantling of them, you could always do it without a confrontation. First, we have a legal framework. There is a law that is passed by parliament in a legitimate way. Iraqis, both the government and the people and the militias themselves, never said anything against it. And also that law not only restructures them, but also gives them or protects their rights as fighters who did service for Iraq, so there is some compensation for it. And then there is an asset that the Iraqi government has that most of the time is overlooked, the Marja'iyya and Najaf. If you get to do it and have the Marja'iyya behind your back, and you do it the right way and taking your time, there is no way that you could have any need for having to do it the hard way and fighting them. You don't want, and the Iraqi government is not interested in pitting their military against those groups, because then that's a civil war, and you don't need to do it if you don't have to. As I said, there is no sense of urgency in Baghdad or in any other place that would warrant this kind of thing. I think they can do it the easy way, and they can do it effectively, and they can do it in a package way, economic, political, and military. And then you save the dignity of these guys. On the other hand, also save the interests of the state and not give them yet another problem on top of the pile of problems they are having right now with everything going on in Iraq.
I think we could integrate the Sistani volunteers, do a DDR process, bring them in, isolate the ones that are acting on behalf of Qom and on behalf of Iran, to isolate them. But I'd actually like to hear what your recommendation is. Could you give them a? I mean, I'd love to see Abu Mehdi al-Mohandes not be able to touch the budget. There's a $1.2 billion budget for salaries, and he distributes it, and he's not giving it to the Sistani volunteers.
I totally agree on the budget issue. I think there's a problem that a lot of the people who have supported the PMF law in Parliament are seeing it as a one-way conduit for basically outsourcing PMF payroll from the militias themselves to the state budget, and they don't have really an interest in implementing the obligations side of the law, and that's where I think the political circumstances are going to be important. There's no interest in doing that. I think even people who pay lip service to the idea of integration, Sayyid Muqtada Sadr, for example, he always says, well, the militias should be integrated. Well, what's stopping him from dismantling his militias? He's using that for moral high ground.
His can be both inside the ISF and outside at the same time. If we're looking at Jaish al-Mahdi and Badr Corps, so that's the issue with.
Integration is always problematic. We've done it in the past in 2003, 2005, and that was not a solution.
I don't buy the argument that the IRGC Quds Force militias don't want to be inside the MOD and the MOI. I think they do. I think they do so they can exploit it. And I think that the DDR process that simply brings in Kitab Hezbollah or AH as a brigade or as a division is problematic, because I think that's exactly where they want to be.
Exactly. I think integration of individuals, not as units, is going to be a very important aspect of any plan for integration. But I'd love to hear thoughts about how do we balance this resource issue? How do we squeeze the budget? How do we, because there's speculation that the PMF budget is overblown, that not all of it is going to the budget, as you pointed out. People who have actually fought and sacrificed, people answering to the Shrine militias, these people are not getting their fair share. So how do we balance that and make sure that those who are, the fighters actually get their pay, and there are no ghost soldiers in this situation?
Yeah, I just want real quick. How is a designated terrorist in Abu Mehdi al-Mohandes in charge of a budget in the Iraqi government to give to the Hashd al-Shabi that's $1.2 billion? I don't understand that.
Again, that goes back to the implementation of the law that I've been pushing to implement until I'm blue in the face.
Would that push Mohandes out?
It will, because what the law says, if you read it carefully, and I've read it backward and forward, is basically that you will not have groups fighting. You will have individuals fighting, all of them assigned to anywhere at the discretion of the commander-in-chief and his commanders. All of the command staff, from the brigadier all the way to the platoon commander, will be officers assigned to these jobs by the commander-in-chief in the same way the army commanders are being assigned. And the top tier of them will be approved by the parliament. So these guys are not generals, therefore they cannot command. A commander in any one of these forces, once the law is implemented, will have to be our equivalent of one-star general or a colonel, or you go down to a lieutenant colonel and all the way to the level of a second lieutenant. This is where you get people from the normal military establishment, officers, graduates of the military academy, and right now they are fighting as, I don't know, Kata'ib Imam Ali or Luwa Abu al-Fadl or etc. There will be none of that. They will be going as individuals, and the commander-in-chief will take them and will put them in a blender and say, you go to Mosul, you go to that. So there will be a complete reshuffle. Once you do that, and you do it in good faith and within the spirit of the law, all of this problem is going to go away. And then all what you have to deal with are the guys who say, no, we don't want to have that. And then they will be very small, and you can have all of your big guns at them, from Sistani to the government apparatus, to the parliament, to the Iraqi people. That what has not been done by Abadi, and that what needs to be done right now by Prime Minister Abdel Mahdi. The law is clear, and it is thrown in the lap of the Prime Minister, not Muqtada Sadr, not any one of these commanders or leaders of groups.
There's an investment question there, right?
Yes.
I mean,
Yes.
we talked about, what the U.S. could do, right? There's a clear investment opportunity right there, which is ensuring that the integration process goes as it should, which is to create a balance of power in favor of Iraqi forces and civilian consolidation of power. But the question was asked about how do we deal with the ghost soldiers problem, and I just want to offer some advice from the Afghan situation, which is not perfect, but how it was dealt with was, one, making sure that ultimately it was realized that this is happening, it's still going on, but it's, I think, one of the ways it was dealt with was making sure that benefits were distributed in a decentralized way and that were controlled primarily by civilians. That is a really big piece of just the technical aspects, is making sure that one commander can't build a fiefdom off of ghost soldier roles, basically. You can only do that if you change the distribution of benefits and make sure that there is civilian oversight on some level from another quadrant of the government.
Well, I'd like to thank our panelists. Thank you all for being here. I hope it was an interesting conversation. Thank you for being on our panel as well. But I'd like to thank you all for sticking this out, and thank you to all of you. Thanks.
All right.
Did you like it?
Loved it.